The Story Girl, Chapter 19, A Dread Prophecy. "I've got to go and begin stomping out the elderberry pasture this afternoon," said Peter dolefully. "I tell you it's a tough job. Mr. Roger might wait for cool weather before he sets people to stomping out elderberries, and that's a fact." "Why don't you tell him so?" asked Anne. "It ain't my business to tell him things," retorted Peter. "I'm hired to do what I'm told, and I do it. But I can have my own opinion all the same. It's going to be a broiling hot day." We were all in the orchard except Felix, who had gone to the post office. It was the forenoon of an August Saturday. Cecily and Sara Ray, who had come up to spend the day with us, her mother having gone to town, were eating timothy roots. Bertha Lawrence, a Charlottetown girl, who had visited Kitty Marr in June, and had gone to school one day with her, had eaten timothy roots, affecting to consider them great delicacies. The fad was at once taken up by the Carlisle schoolgirls. Timothy roots quite ousted sours and young raspberry sprouts, both of which had the real merit of being quite toothsome, while timothy roots were tough and tasteless. But timothy roots were fashionable. Therefore timothy roots must be eaten. Pecks of them must have been devoured in Carlisle that summer. Pat was there also, padding about from one to the other on his black paws, giving us friendly pokes and rubs. We all made much of him except Felicity, who would not take any notice of him because he was the Story Girl's cat. We boys were sprawling on the grass. Our morning chores were done, and the day was before us. We should have been feeling very comfortable and happy, but as a matter of fact we were not particularly so. The Story Girl was sitting on the mint beside the well house, weaving herself a wreath of buttercups. Felicity was sipping from a cup of clouded blue with an overdone air of unconcern. Each was actually miserably conscious of the other's presence, and each was desirous of convincing the rest of us that the other was less than nothing to her. Felicity could not succeed. The Story Girl managed it better. If it had not been for the fact that in all our foregatherings she was careful to sit as far from Felicity as possible, we might have been deceived. We had not passed a very pleasant week. Felicity and the Story Girl had not been speaking to each other. Consequently there had been something rotten in the state of Denmark. An air of restraint was over all our games and conversations. On the preceding Monday, Felicity and the Story Girl had quarreled over something. What the cause of the quarrel was I cannot tell, because I never knew. It remained a dead secret between the parties of the first and second part forever. But it was more bitter than the general run of their tiffs, and the consequences were apparent to all. They had not spoken to each other since. This was not because the rancor of either lasted so long. On the contrary, it passed speedily away, not even one low descending sun going down on their wrath. But dignity remained to be considered. Neither would speak first, and each obstinately declared that she would not speak first. No, not in 100 years. Neither argument, entreaty, nor explanation had any effect on those two stubborn girls. "I don't know where you expect to go when you die, Felicity," she said tearfully, "if you don't forgive people." "I have forgiven her," was Felicity's answer, "but I am not going to speak first for all that." "It's very wrong, and more than that, it's so uncomfortable," complained Cecily. "It spoils everything." "Were they ever like this before?" I asked Cecily, as we talked the matter over privately in Uncle Stephen's Walk. "Never for so long," said Cecily. "They had a spell like this last summer, and one the summer before, but they only lasted a couple of days." "And who spoke first?" "Oh, the Story Girl. She got excited about something and spoke to Felicity before she thought, and then it was all over. But I'm afraid it isn't going to be like that this time. Don't you notice how careful the Story Girl is not to get excited? That is such a bad sign. We've just got to think up something that will excite her, that's all, I said. I'm praying about it, said Cecily in a low voice, her tear-wet lashes trembling against her pale round cheeks. Do you suppose it will do any good, Bev? Very likely, I assured her. Remember Sara Ray and the money? It came from praying. I'm glad you think so, said Cecily tremulously. Dan said it was of no use for me to bother praying about it. He said if they couldn't speak, God might do something. But when they just wouldn't, he wasn't likely to interfere. Dan does say such odd things. I'm so afraid he's going to grow up just like Uncle Robert Ward, who never goes to church and doesn't believe more than half the Bible is true. Which half does he believe is true? I inquired, with unholy curiosity. Oh, just the nice parts. He says there's a heaven all right, but no hell. I don't want Dan to grow up like that. It isn't respectable, and you wouldn't want all kinds of people crowding into heaven, now would you? Well, no, I suppose not, I agreed, thinking of Billy Robinson. Of course, I can't help feeling sorry for those who have to go to the other place, said Cecily compassionately, but I suppose they wouldn't be very comfortable in heaven either. They wouldn't feel at home. Andrew Marr said a simply dreadful thing about the other place one night last fall, when Felicity and I were down to see Kitty, and they were burning the potato stalks. He said he believed the other place might be lots more interesting than heaven because fires were such jolly things. Now, did you ever hear a thing like that? I guess it depends a good deal on whether you're inside or outside the fire. Oh, Andrew didn't really mean it, of course. He just said it to sound smart and make us stare. The Marrs are all like that. But anyhow, I'm going to keep on praying that something will happen to excite the Story Girl. I don't believe there's any use in praying that Felicity will speak first, because I'm sure she won't. But don't you suppose God could make her? I said, feeling that it wasn't quite fair that the Story Girl should always have to speak first. If she had spoken first the other times, it was surely Felicity's turn this time. Well, I believe it would puzzle him, said Cecily, out of the depths of her experience with Felicity. Peter, as was to be expected, took Felicity's part and said the Story Girl ought to speak first because she was the oldest. That, he said, had always been his Aunt Jane's rule. Sara Ray thought Felicity should speak first because the Story Girl was half an orphan. Felix tried to make peace between them, and met the usual fate of all peacemakers. The Story Girl loftily told him that he was too young to understand, and Felicity said that fat boys should mind their own business. After that, Felix dared it would serve Felicity right if the Story Girl never spoke to her again. Dan had no patience with either of the girls, especially Felicity. What they both want is a right good spanking, he said. If only a spanking would mend the matter, it was not likely it would ever be mended. Both Felicity and the Story Girl were rather too old to be spanked, and if they had not been, none of the grown-ups would have thought it worth while to administer so desperate a remedy for what they considered so insignificant a trouble. With the usual levity of grown-ups, they regarded the coldness between the girls as a subject of mirth and jest, and reckoned not that it was freezing the genial current of our youthful souls, and blighting hours that should have been fair pages in our book of days. The Story Girl finished her wreath and put it on. The buttercups dropped over her high white brow, and played peep with her glowing eyes. A dreamy smile hovered around her poppy-red mouth, a sufficient smile which, to those of us skilled in its interpretation, betook the sentence which soon came. I know a story about a man who always had his own opinion. The Story Girl got no further. We never heard the story of the man who always had his own opinion. Felix came tearing up the lane with a newspaper in his hand. When a boy as fat as Felix ran at full speed on a boiling August afternoon, he has something to run for, as Felicity remarked. "Oh, I hope nothing has happened to father," I exclaimed, springing anxiously to my feet, a sick, horrible feeling of fear running over me like a cool, rippling wave. "It's just as likely to be good news he is running for as bad," said the Story Girl, who was no believer in meeting trouble halfway. "He wouldn't be running as fast for good news," said Dan cynically. We were not left long in doubt. The orchard gate flew open, and Felix was among us. One glimpse of his face told us that he was no bearer of glad tidings. Instead, he was as pale as are the dead. I could have asked him what was the matter, had my life depended on it. It was Felicity who demanded impatiently of my shaking, voiceless brother. "Felix King, what has scared you?" Felix held out the newspaper. It was the Charlottetown Daily Enterprise. "It's here," he gasped. "Look, read. Oh, do you think it's true? The end of the world? It's coming tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon?" Crash! Felicity had dropped the cup of cloud blue, which had passed unscathed through so many changing years, and now at last lay shattered on the stone of the wall curb. At any other time we should have been aghast over such a catastrophe, but it passed unnoticed now. What mattered it that all the cups in the world be broken today, if the crack of doom must sound tomorrow? "Oh, Sarah Stanley, do you believe it? Do you?" gasped Felicity, clutching the Story Girl's hand. Cecily's prayers had been answered. Excitement had come with a vengeance, and under its stress Felicity had spoken first. But this, like the breaking of the cup, had no significance for us at that moment. The Story Girl snatched the paper and read the announcement to a group on which sudden, tense silence had fallen. Under a sensational headline, "The last trump will sound at 2 o'clock tomorrow," was a paragraph to the effect that the leader of a certain noted sect in the United States had predicted that August 12th would be the Judgment Day, and that all his numerous followers were preparing for the dreadful event by praying, fasting, and making of appropriate white garments for ascension robes. I laugh at the remembrance now until I recall the real horror of fear and enwrapped us in that sunny orchard that August morning of long ago. And then I laugh no more. We were only children, be it remembered, with a very firm and simple faith that grown-up people knew much more than we did, and a rooted conviction that whatever you read in a newspaper must be true. If the Daily Enterprise said that August 12th was to be Judgment Day, how were you going to get around it? "Do you believe it, Sarah Stanley?" persisted Felicity. "Do you?" No, I don't believe a word of it," said the Story Girl. But for once her voice failed to carry conviction. Or rather, it carried conviction of the very opposite kind. It was borne in upon our miserable minds that if the Story Girl did not altogether believe it was true, she believed it might be true, and that the possibility was almost as dreadful as the certainty. "It can't be true," said Sara Ray, seeking refuge as usual in tears. "Why, everything just looks the same. Things couldn't look the same if the Judgment Day were going to be tomorrow." "But that's just the way it's come," I said uncomfortably. "It tells you in the Bible. It's to come just like a thief in the night." "But it tells you another thing in the Bible, too," said Cecily eagerly. "It says nobody knows when the Judgment Day is to come, not even the angels in heaven. Now, if the angels in heaven don't know it, do you suppose the editor of the Enterprise can tell it? And him a grit, too." "I guess he knows as much about it as a Tory would," retorted the Story Girl. Uncle Roger was a liberal, and Uncle Alec a conservative, and the girls held fast to the political traditions of their respective households. But it isn't really the Enterprise editor at all who is saying it. It's a man in the States who claims to be a prophet. If he is a prophet, perhaps he has found out somehow. And it's in the paper, too, and that's printed as well as the Bible, said Dan. Well, I'm going to depend on the Bible, said Cecily. I don't believe it's Judgment Day tomorrow, but I'm scared for all that, she added piteously. That was exactly the position of all of us. As in the case of the bell-ringing ghost, we did not believe, but we trembled. Nobody might have known when the Bible was written, said Dan, but maybe somebody knows now. Why, the Bible was written thousands of years ago, and that paper was printed this very morning. There's been time to find out ever so much more. I want to do so many things, said the Story Girl, plucking off her crown of buttercups, gold with a tragic gesture. But if it's the Judgment Day tomorrow, I won't have time to do any of them. It can't be much worse than dying, I suppose, said Felix, grasping at straws of comfort. I'm awful glad I got into the habit of going to church on Sunday school this summer, said Peter very soberly. I wish I'd made up my mind before whether to be a Presbyterian or a Methodist. Do you suppose it's too late now? Oh, that doesn't matter, said Cecily earnestly. If you're a Christian, Peter, that's all that's necessary. But it's too late for that, said Peter miserably. I can't turn into a Christian between this time and 2 o'clock tomorrow. I'll just have to be satisfied with making up my mind to be a Presbyterian or a Methodist. I wanted to wait till I got old enough to make out what was the difference between them, but I'll have to chance it now. I guess I'll be a Presbyterian, 'cause I want to be like the rest of you. Yes, I'll be a Presbyterian. I know a story about Judy Pineau and the word Presbyterian, said the Story Girl, but I can't tell it now. If tomorrow isn't the Judgment Day, I'll tell it Monday. If I had known that tomorrow might be the Judgment Day, I wouldn't have quarreled with you last Monday, Sarah Stanley, or been so horrible and sulky all the week. Indeed I wouldn't, said Felicity, with very unusual humility. Oh, Felicity, we all, in the depths of our pitiful little souls, reviewing the innumerable things we would or would not have done if we had known. What a black and endless list they made, those sins of omission and commission that rushed accusingly across our young memories. For us the leaves of the book of judgment were already opened, and we stood at the bar of our own consciousness, then which for youth or eld there can be no more dread tribunal. I thought of all the evil deeds of my short life, of pinching Felix to make him cry out at family prayer, of playing truant from Sunday school and going fishing one day, of a certain fib, no, away in this awful hour with all such euphemious evasions, of a lie I had once told, of a many selfish and unkind words and thoughts and accusations, and tomorrow might be the great and terrible day of the last accounting? Oh, if I had only been a better boy! The quarrel was as much my fault as yours, Felicity, said the Story Girl, putting her arm around Felicity. We can't undo it now, but if tomorrow isn't the Judgment Day, we must be careful never to quarrel again. Oh, I wish Father were home. He will be, said Cecily. If it's Judgment Day for Prince Edward Island, it will be for Europe too. I wish we could just know whether what the paper says is true or not, said Felix desperately. It seems to me I could brace up if I just knew. But to whom could we appeal? Uncle Alec was away, and would not be back until late that night. Neither Aunt Janet nor Uncle Roger were people to whom we cared to apply in such a crisis. We were afraid of the Judgment Day, but we were almost equally afraid of being laughed at. How about Aunt Olivia? No, Aunt Olivia had gone to bed with a sick headache and mustn't be disturbed. And the Story Girl, she said I must get dinner ready because there was plenty of cold meat and nothing to do but boil the potatoes and peas and set the table. I don't know how I can put my thoughts into it when Judgment Day may be tomorrow. Besides, what is the good of asking the grown-ups? They don't know anything more about this than we do. But if they just say they didn't believe it, it would be a sort of comfort, said Cecily. I suppose the minister would know, but he's away on vacation, said Felicity. Anyhow, I'll go and ask Mother what she thinks of it. Felicity picked up the Enterprise and betook herself to the house. We awaited her return in dire suspense. Well, what did she say? Asked Cecily. She said, run away and don't bother me. I haven't time for your nonsense, responded Felicity in an injured tone. And I said, but Ma, the paper says tomorrow is Judgment Day, and Ma just said, Judgment fiddlesticks. Well, that's kind of comforting, said Peter. She can't put any faith in it, or she'd be more worked up. If it only wasn't printed, said Dan gloomily. Let's all go over and ask Uncle Roger, said Felix desperately. That we should make Uncle Roger a court of last resort indicated all too clearly the state of our minds, but we went. Uncle Roger was in his barnyard, hitching his black mare into the buggy. His copy of the Enterprise was sticking out of his pocket. He looked, as we saw, with sinking hearts, unusually grave and preoccupied. There was not a glimmer or a smile about his face. You ask him, said Felicity, nudging the Story Girl. Uncle Roger, said the Story Girl, the golden notes in her voice threatening with fear and appeal. The Enterprise says that tomorrow is Judgment Day. Is it? Do you think it is? I'm afraid so, said Uncle Roger gravely. The Enterprise is always very careful to print only reliable news. But Mother doesn't believe it, cried Felicity. Uncle Roger shook his head. That is just the trouble, he said. People won't believe it till it's too late. I'm going straight to Markdale to pay a man there some money I owe him. And after dinner I'm going to Summerside to buy me a new suit. My old one is too shabby for Judgment Day. He got into his buggy and drove away, leaving 8 distracted mortals behind him. Well, I suppose that settles it, said Peter in a despairing tone. Is there anything we can do to prepare? Asked Cecily. I wish I had a white dress like you girls, sobbed Sara Ray, but I haven't, and it's too late to get one. Oh, I wish I had minded what Ma said. I couldn't have disobeyed her so often if I thought the Judgment Day was so near. When I go home, I'm going to tell her about going to the magic lantern show. I'm not sure that Uncle Roger meant what he said, remarked the Story Girl. I couldn't get a look into his eyes. If he was trying to hoax us, there would be a twinkle in them. He can never help that. You know, he would think it just a great joke to frighten us like this. It's really dreadful to have grown-ups that you can't depend on. We could depend on Father if he were here, said Dan stoutly. He'd tell us the truth. He would tell us what he thought was true, but he couldn't know. He's not such a well-educated man as the editor of the Enterprise. No, there's nothing to do but to wait and see. Let us go into the house and read just what the Bible says about it, suggested Cecily. We crept in carefully, lest we disturb Aunt Olivia, and Cecily found and read the significant portion of Holy Writ. There was little comfort for us in that vivid and terrible picture. Well, said the Story Girl finally, I must go and get the potatoes ready. I suppose they must be boiled, even if the Judgment Day is tomorrow. But I don't believe it is. And I've got to go and stamp elderberries, said Peter. I don't see how I can do it. Go away back there alone. I'll feel scared to death the whole time. Tell Uncle Roger that, and say if tomorrow is the end of the world, that there is no good in stamping any more fields, I suggested. Yes, and if he lets you off, then we'll know he was in earnest, chimed in Cecily. But if he still says you must go, that'll be a sign he doesn't believe it. Leaving the Story Girl and Peter to peel their potatoes, the rest of us went home, where Aunt Janet, who had gone to the well and found the fragment of the blue cup, gave poor Felicity a bitter scolding about it. But Felicity bore it very patiently. Nay, more, she seemed to delight in it. Ma can't believe tomorrow is the last day, or she wouldn't scold like that, she told us, and this comforted us until after dinner. Then the Story Girl and Peter came over and told us that Uncle Roger had really gone to Summerside. Then we plunged down into fear and wretchedness again. But he said I must go and stomp the elderberries just the same, said Peter. He said it might not be the Judgment Day tomorrow, though he believed it was, and it would keep me out of mischief. But I just can't stand it back there alone. Some of you fellows must come with me. I don't want you to work, but just be my company. It was finally decided that Dan and Felix should go. I wanted to go also, but the girls protested. You must stay and keep us cheered up, implored Felicity. I just don't know how I'm ever going to put in this afternoon. I promised Kitty Marr that I'd go down and spend it with her, but I can't now. I can't knit any of my lace. I just keep thinking, what is the use? Perhaps it'll all be burned up tomorrow. So I stayed with the girls, and a miserable afternoon we had of it. The Story Girl again and again declared that she didn't believe it, but when we asked her to tell a story, she evaded it with a flimsy excuse. Cecily pestered Aunt Janet's life out, asking repeatedly, Ma, will you be washing Monday? Ma, will you go to prayer meeting Tuesday night? Ma, will you be preserving raspberries next week? And various similar questions. It was a huge comfort to her that Aunt Janet always said yes, or of course, as if there could be no question about it. Sara Ray cried until I wondered how one small head could contain all the tears she shed. But I do not believe she was half as much frightened as disappointed that she had no white dress. In mid-afternoon Cecily came downstairs with her forget-me-not jug in her hand, a dainty bit of china, wreathed with dark blue forget-me-nots, which Cecily prized highly, and in which she always kept her toothbrush. Sara, I'm going to give you this jug, she said solemnly. Now Sara had always coveted this particular jug. She stopped crying long enough to clutch it delightedly. Oh, Cecily, thank you. But are you sure you won't want it back tomorrow if it isn't Judgment Day? No, it's yours for good, said Cecily, with high remote air of one whom forget-me-not jugs and all such pomps and vanities of the world were as a tale that is told. Are you going to give anyone your cherry vase? Asked Felicity, trying to speak indifferently. Felicity had never admired the forget-me-not jug, but she had always hankered after the cherry vase, an affair of white glass with a cluster of red glass cherries and golden-green glass leaves on its side, which Aunt Olivia had given Cecily one Christmas. No, I'm not, answered Cecily with a change of tone. Oh, well, I don't care, said Felicity quickly. Only, if tomorrow is the last day, the cherry vase won't be of much use to you. I guess it will be as much use to me as to anyone else, said Cecily indignantly. She had sacrificed her dear forget-me-not jug to satisfy some pang of conscience or propitiate some threatening fate, but surrender her precious cherry vase she could not and would not. Felicity needn't be giving any hints. With the gathering shades of night, our plight became pitiful. In the daylight, surrounded by homely, familiar sights and sounds, it was not so difficult to fortify our souls with cheering incredulity. But now, in this time of shadows, dread, belief clutched us and wrung us with terror. If there had been one wise older friend to tell us in serious fashion that we need not be afraid, that the Enterprise paragraph was not, save the idle report of a deluded fanatic, it would have been well for us. But there was not. Our grown-ups instead considered our terror an exquisite joke. At that very moment Aunt Olivia had recovered from her headache, and Aunt Janet were laughing in the kitchen over the state of the children were in because they were afraid the end of the world was close at hand. Aunt Janet's throaty gurgle and Aunt Olivia's trilling mirth floated out through the open window. "Perhaps they'll laugh on the other side of their faces tomorrow," said Dan with gloomy satisfaction. We were sitting on the cellar hatch, watching what might be our last sunset o'er the dark hills of time. Peter was with us. It was his Sunday to go home, but he had elected to remain. "If tomorrow is the Judgment Day, I want to be with you fellows," he said. Sara Ray had also yearned to stay, but could not because her mother had told her she must be home before dark. "Never mind, Sara," comforted Cecily. "It's not to be till 2 o'clock tomorrow, so you'll have plenty of time to get back here before anything happens." "But there might be a mistake," sobbed Sara. "It might be at 2 o'clock tonight instead of tomorrow." It might, indeed. This was a new horror, which had not occurred to us. "I'm sure I won't sleep a wink tonight," said Felix. "The paper says 2 o'clock tomorrow," said Dan. "You needn't worry, Sara." But Sara departed weeping. She did not, however, forget to carry the forget-me-not jug with her. All things considered, her departure was a relief. Such a constantly tearful damsel was not a pleasant companion. Cecily and Felicity and the Story Girl did not cry. They were made of finer, firm stuff, dry-eyed with such courage as they might. They faced whatever might be in store for them. "I wonder where we'll all be this time tomorrow night," said Felix mournfully, as we watched the sunset between the dark fir boughs. It was an ominous sunset. The sun dropped down amid dark, livid clouds that turned sullen shades of purple and fiery red behind him. "I hope we'll be together, wherever we are," said Cecily gently. "Nothing can be so very bad then." "I'm going to read the Bible all tomorrow forenoon," said Peter. Then Aunt Olivia came out to go home. The Story Girl asked her permission to stay all night with Felicity and Cecily, and Olivia assented lightly, swinging her hat on her arm and including us all in a friendly smile. She looked very pretty with her big blue eyes and warm-hued golden hair. We loved Aunt Olivia. But just now we resented her having laughed at us with Aunt Janet, and we refused to smile back. "What a sulky and sullen lot of little people," said Aunt Olivia, going away across the yard, holding her pretty dress up from the dewy grass. Peter resolved to stay all night with us, too, not troubling himself about anybody's permission. When we went to bed, it was settling down for a stormy night, and the rain was streaming wetly on the roof, as if the world, like Sara Ray, were weeping because its end was so near. Nobody forgot or hurried over his prayers that night. We would dearly have loved to leave the candle burning, but Aunt Janet's decree regarding this was as inexorable as any of Mede and Persian. Out the candle must go, and we lay there quaking, with the wild rain streaming down on the roof above us, and the voices of the storm wailing through the writhing spruce trees. Chapter 20. The Judgment Sunday. Sunday morning broke, dull and gray. The rain had ceased, but the clouds hung dark and brooding above a world which, in its windless calm, following the spent storm throe, seemed to us to be waiting till judgment spoke the doom of fate. We were all up early. None of us, it appeared, had slept well, and some of us not at all. The Story Girl had been among the latter. and she looked very pale and wan, with black shadows under her deep-set eyes. Peter, however, had slept soundly enough after 12 o'clock. "When you've been stamping out elderberries all the afternoon, it'll take more than the Judgment Day to keep you awake all night," he said. "But when I woke up this morning, it was just awful. I'd forgot for a moment, and then it all came back with a rush, and I was worse scared than ever." Cecily was pale but brave. For the first time in years she had not put her hair up in curls on Saturday night. It was brushed and braided with Puritan simplicity. "If it is Judgment Day, I don't care whether my hair is curly or not," she said. "Well," said Aunt Janet, when we all descended to the kitchen, "this is the first time you young ones ever got up without being called, and that's a fact." At breakfast our appetites were poor. How could the grown-ups eat as they did? After breakfast and the necessary chores, there were the forenoon to be lived through. Peter, true to his word, got out his Bible and began to read from the first chapter in Genesis. "I won't have time to read it all through, I suppose," he said, "but I'll get along as far as I can." There was no preaching in Carlisle that day, and Sunday school was not till the evening. Cecily got out her lesson slip and studied the lesson conscientiously. The rest of us did not see how she could do it. We could not, and that was very certain. "If it isn't the Judgment Day, I want to have the lesson learned," she said. "And if it is, I'll feel I've done what was right. But I never found it so hard to remember the golden text before." The long, dragging hours were hard to endure. We roamed restlessly about and went to and fro, all save Peter, who still steadily read away in his Bible. He was through Genesis by 11 and beginning on Exodus. "There's a good deal of it I don't understand," he said, "but I'll read every word, and that's the main thing. That story about Joseph and his brother was so interesting I almost forgot about the Judgment Day." But the long drawn-out dread was beginning to get on Dan's nerves. "If it is the Judgment Day," he growled, "I wish it'd hurry up and have it over with." "Oh, Dan!" cried Felicity and Cecily together in a chorus of horror, but the Story Girl looked as if she rather sympathized with Dan. If we had eaten little breakfast, we could eat still less at dinner. After dinner the clouds rolled away, and the sun came joyously and gloriously out. This, we thought, was a good omen. Felicity opined that it wouldn't have cleared up if it was Judgment Day. Nevertheless, we dressed ourselves carefully, and the girls put on their white dresses. Sara Ray came up, still crying, of course. She increased our uneasiness by saying that her mother believed the Enterprise paragraph, and was afraid that the end of the world was really at hand. "That's why she let me come up," she said, sobbing. "If she hadn't been afraid, I don't believe she would have let me come up. But I'd have died if I couldn't have come. And she wasn't a bit cross when I told her I'd gone to the magic lantern show. That's an awful bad sign. I hadn't a white dress, but I put on my white muslin apron with the frills." "That seems kind of odd," said Felicity doubtfully. "You wouldn't put on the apron to go to the church, and so it doesn't seem as if it was proper to put it on for the Judgment Day either." "Well, it's the best I could do," said Sara. "I wanted to have something white on. It's just like a dress, only it hasn't sleeves." "Let's go into the orchard and wait," said the Story Girl. "It's 1 o'clock now, so in another hour we'll know the worst. We'll leave the front door open, and we'll leave the big clock within striking distance, so we can hear if it strikes 2. No better plan being suggested, we betook ourselves to the orchard and sat on the boughs of Uncle Alec's tree because the grass was wet. The world was beautiful and peaceful and green. Overhead was a dazzling blue sky, spotted with heaps of white clouds. "Pshaw! I don't believe there's any fear of it being the last day," said Dan, beginning to whistle out a tune in bravado. Well, don't whistle on Sunday anyhow, said Felicity severely. I don't see a thing about Methodists or Presbyterians as far as I've gone, and I'm most through Exodus, said Peter suddenly. When does it begin to tell about them? There's nothing about Methodists or Presbyterians in the Bible, said Felicity scornfully. Peter looked amazed. Well, how did they happen then? He asked. When did they begin to be? I've often thought it such a strange thing that there isn't a word about either of them in the Bible, said Cecily, especially when it mentions Baptists, or at least one Baptist. Well, anyhow, said Peter, even if it isn't the Judgment Day, I'm going to keep on reading the Bible until I've got clean through. I never thought it was such an interesting book. It sounds simply dreadful to hear you call the Bible an interesting book, said Felicity, with a shudder at the sacrilege. Why, you might be talking of any common book. I didn't mean any harm, said Peter, crestfallen. The Bible is an interesting book, said the Story Girl, coming to Peter's rescue, and there are magnificent stories in it. Yes, Felicity, magnificent. If the world doesn't come to an end, I'll tell you the story of Ruth next Sunday. Oh, look here. I'll tell it anyhow. It's a promise. Wherever we are next Sunday, I'll tell you about Ruth. Why, you wouldn't tell stories in heaven, said Cecily, in a very timid voice. Why not? Said the Story Girl with a flash of her eyes. Indeed I shall. I'll tell stories as long as I've a tongue and talk, or any one to listen. It must be getting close to 2, said Cecily. It seems as if we've been here waiting for hours and hours. Conversation languished. We watched and waited nervously. The moments dragged by, each seeming an hour. Would 2 o'clock never come to end the suspense? We all became very tense. Even Peter had to stop reading. Any unaccustomed sound or sight in the world about us struck on our taut senses like the trump of doom. A cloud passed over the sun, and as sudden shadows swept across the orchard, we turned pale and trembled. A wagon rumbling over the plank bridge in the hollow made Sara Ray start up with a shriek. The slamming of a barn door over at Uncle Roger's caused the cold perspiration to break out on our faces. I don't believe it is the Judgment Day, said Felix, and I never have believed it. But I just wish that clock would strike 2. Can't you tell us a story to pass the time? I entreated the Story Girl. She shook her head. No, it would be of no use to try. But if this isn't the Judgment Day, I'll have a great one to tell us about us being scared. Pat presently came galloping up the orchard carrying his mouth a big field mouse, which, sitting down before us, he proceeded to devour, body and bones, afterwards licking his chops with great satisfaction. It can't be the Judgment Day, said Sara Ray, brightening up. Patty would never be eating mice if it was. If that clock doesn't soon strike 2, I shall go out of my senses, declared Cecily with unusual vehemence. Time always seems long when you're waiting, said the Story Girl, but it does seem as if we have been here for more than an hour. Maybe the clock struck and we didn't hear it, suggested Dan. Somebody better go see. I'll go, said Cecily. Suppose even if anything happens, I'll have time to get back to you. We watched her white-clad figure pass through the gate and enter the front door. A few minutes passed, or a few years. We could not have told you which. Then Cecily came running at full speed back to us, but when she reached us, she trembled so much that at first she could not speak. What is it? Is it past 2? implored the Story Girl. It's 4, said Cecily with a gasp. The old clock isn't going. Mother forgot to wind it up last night, and it stopped. But it's 4 by the kitchen clock, so it isn't the Judgment Day, and tea's ready, and Mother says to come in. We looked at each other, realizing what our dread had been, now that it was left. It was not the judgment day. The world and life were still before us, with all their potent lure of years unknown. "I'll never believe anything I read in the papers again," said Dan, rushing to the opposite extreme. "I told you the Bible was more to be depended on than the newspaper," said Cecily triumphantly. Sara, Ray, and Peter and the Story Girl went home, and we went in to tea with royal appetite. Afterward, we dressed for Sunday school upstairs, our spirits carried away to such an extent that Aunt Janet had to come twice to the foot of the stairs and inquire severely, "Children, have you forgotten what day this is?" "Isn't it nice that we're going to live a spell longer in this nice world?" said Felix as we walked down the hill. "Yes, and Felicity and the Story Girl are speaking again," said Cecily happily. "And Felicity did speak first," I said. "Yes, but it took the Judgment Day to make her." "I wish," said Cecily with a sigh, "that I hadn't been in quite such a hurry giving away my forget-me-not jug." "And I wish I hadn't been in such a hurry deciding to be a Presbyterian," said Peter. "Well, it's not too late for that," said Dan. "You can change your mind now." "No, sir," said Peter with a flash of spirit. "I ain't one of a kind that says that I'll be something, and then, 'cause they're scared, and when the scare is over, go back on it. I said I'd be a Presbyterian, and I mean to stick to it." "You said you knew a story about that had something to do with Presbyterians," I said to the Story Girl. "Tell us it now." "Oh, no, it isn't the right kind of story to tell on Sunday," she replied, "but I'll tell it tomorrow morning." Accordingly, we heard it the next morning in the orchard. "Long ago, when Judy Pineau was young," said the Story Girl, "she was hired with Mrs. Elder Frewen, the first Mrs. Elder Frewen. Mrs. Frewen had been a school teacher, and she was very particular as to how people talked and the grammar they used, and she didn't like anything but refined words. One very hot day she heard Judy Pineau say she was all in a sweat. Mrs. Frewen was greatly shocked and said, "Judy, you shouldn't say that. It's only horses that sweat. You should say you are in perspiration." Well, Judy promised she'd remember, because she liked Mrs. Freneau and was anxious to please her. Not long afterwards, Judy was scrubbing the kitchen floor one morning, and when Mrs. Freneau came in, Judy looked up and said, quite proud over using the right word, "Oh, Miss Frewen, ain't it awful hot, I declare. I'm all in a Presbyterian."